Plugged In. I'm Greta Van Susteren, and each week at this time, Plugged In dives into U.S. policy, questioning those who make and shape policy, and you'll hear various opinions about that policy. And by being plugged in, you will have the chance to speak up and get involved. We're live at Facebook, at Voice of America, and we want your comments and questions. Today, we examine nuclear weapons and the U.S. arsenal. The Trump administration just finished its first nuclear posture review. It's the first nuclear review since 2010. We begin with VOA's Pentagon correspondent, Carla Babb. Carla, much has changed in the world since 2010. Is anything changing with our nuclear weapons?
Yes, Greta, there are actually two changes ahead, drawing both critics and supporters as the Pentagon works to modernize what is called the country's nuclear triad. The air, land, and sea-based components of the U.S. nuclear arsenal are all expected to reach the end of their use in the next decade. Experts say that if the United States does not act now to modernize its inventory, the whole point of that arsenal, deterring other nations from using their nuclear weapons, could be in jeopardy.
States' actions will cause an arms race. But I think arms race is already going on, except right now the United States is not racing.
Analysts say Russia and China have about a 2-decade head start on updating their nuclear weapons programs. Also looming large, the threat of North Korea and Iran developing nuclear weapons. To counter this changing environment, the Pentagon is calling for 2 additions to the U.S. nuclear arsenal. One brings back the nuclear sea-launched cruise missile, a capability the U.S. maintained during the Cold War. The other adds a low-yield or less powerful submarine-launched ballistic missile. This addition would impede any ideas America's strongest nuclear adversary, Russia, might have about using its own low-yield weapons to get its way in a small conflict.
I would prefer that we go back to the path we were on 10 years ago of both sides reducing the role of nuclear weapons in their foreign policies. I just don't think that Russia's really giving us that choice right now. So temporarily, I think we have to be a little bit more assertive than I would even prefer. But in terms of specific...
And experts hinted the key change, Greta, is the tone of this administration's nuclear posture review. The 2010 Obama posture review struck a balance between maintaining a safe and effective nuclear arsenal and working towards the goal of a world without nuclear weapons. But the Trump administration is mostly focused on maintaining America's arsenal, with arms control taking a back seat.
Carl, everyone talks about the need to modernize, and you just said that in 10 years that we need to do something to our arsenal. What happens to these weapons over the last 40 or 50 years that we need to modernize?
Well, we're pushing the limits now. In fact, Michaela Dodge, who was in my report, she was telling me that this is the longest we've ever gone without updating and modernizing our nuclear weapons. And so we're kind of pushing the boundaries right now. For example, with the Ohio-class sub, those hulls can last about 40 years. So they have to start transitioning out in 2029. Or we may have a gap in that triad where there won't be submarines with nuclear capabilities and nuclear weapons out there while we're trying to replace them.
But we've got 10 years, maybe.
We think so. It's really a guess. It's really a gamble. But we're working on that. We're working on all different efforts within the nuclear triad. We're replacing the B-2s with the B-21s. We're also going to update the command and control of the Minuteman, those intercontinental ballistic missiles as well.
Carla Babb, thank you very much. She's our VOA's Pentagon correspondent. Thank you for joining us. Several days ago, I sat down with Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy David Trachtenberg. I asked him why a new nuclear posture review is necessary.
Well, the first thing that has changed dramatically is the nature of the nuclear threat that the United States must confront in today's strategic environment. What I mean by that is that over the years, certainly over the past decade, Russia, China, North Korea, others have continued to increase the size and capacities of their own nuclear arsenals, while the United States has focused on trying to reduce the salience and size of its nuclear arsenal. And so the world looks a lot different now as other potential adversaries and other countries seem to place a growing emphasis on nuclear weapons and the role they play.
So why does Russia want low yield? What's the tactical advantage to low yield?
Russia may believe, we think Russia may believe, that if it uses or threatens to use low-yield weapons that reduce the level of destructiveness.
Meaning smaller areas?
Smaller areas of destructiveness, that they could gain some tactical advantage by doing so, putting the United States in a position where we did not have either the capability to respond similarly, or that our response would be escalatory and more massive. And we don't want to escalate any kind of nuclear crisis to the point where the result is catastrophic damage on both sides. We're seeking to avoid that. And the way to avoid that is to convince Russia that there is no level of violence that they can engage in that we do not have either the capability or the will to respond.
And you don't see that as escalating sort of a mini nuclear arms race by the low yield?
The idea is to prevent it from happening, and the way you prevent it is by convincing any potential adversary that there is no level of violence like that where they feel they have a military advantage in actually engaging in that kind of an attack.
Do those low yield violate our agreements with Russia?
Absolutely not.
When, under the NPR nuclear posture review, when would the U.S. use nuclear weapons?
Hopefully, the U.S. will never use nuclear weapons.
But what is sort of the trigger, or what's the message to the world of the U.S. with its weapons?
The message in the nuclear posture review is that the United States will not use or consider using nuclear weapons except in extreme circumstances where the vital national interests are at risk.
Self-defense only, then? Is only in self-defense and not as offensively, and not that we would only use nuclear weapons in self-defense?
No, we would only use nuclear weapons to protect our own vital interests in extreme circumstances. Now, what constitutes an extreme circumstance? The NPR leaves that deliberately ambiguous because we don't want to say right up front when we will or when we won't. But we want to make sure that any potential adversary or opponent thinks twice before they consider the use of nuclear weapons. And so there is...
nuclear weapons, the United States would use nuclear weapons in response, maybe. That's a considered. What about a cyber attack? A cyber attack on the infrastructure of the United States, or even on our military system in any way? Would a cyber attack be extreme circumstance?
Not necessarily. It could be. It depends on the effect. U.S. policy remains that the United States will determine, based on the effect of any attack on us or on our allies, we will be the ones that determine how best to respond. That response may be of a conventional nature. It may be some kind of asymmetric type of response. It may involve nuclear weapons. But that choice is essentially ours, depending on the nature and effect of any such attack or aggression on us or our allies. So there's nothing automatic that would trigger a nuclear response on the part of the United States.
But it's not to say that it's only extreme circumstances isn't only a nuclear attack.
Extreme circumstances could encompass a range of things. But again, it depends on the effect of any such attack. There are potentially catastrophic effects that could be that could be launched against the United States. Attacks on civilian populations, attacks on infrastructure, what have you.
Biological, chemical attack?
Could be as well, which again is not inconsistent with the prior administration's nuclear policy, and it's not inconsistent with the mainstream of where U.S. nuclear policy has been for decades.
At the height of the Cold War in 1986, there were more than 64,000 nuclear warheads in the world. That number is now down to 9,200, and the U.S. has 4,000 of them. One of those who helped bring those numbers down is former Senator Sam Nunn. He is now co-chairman of the Nuclear Threat Initiative and was key to securing nuclear stockpiles in Eastern Europe right after the Cold War. He joined me at VOA to discuss the nuclear posture review. Now, Nunn says that modernization of the U.S. nuclear arsenal is necessary, but does question the need for low-yield weapons.
The key is survivability, and the key is reliability, and the key is safe, secure. So as long as we have nuclear weapons, we have to have them safe, secure, reliable, and in my view, as many as possible survivable, meaning they can take a first attack and still be able to retaliate. That's what deterrence is, and that's what stability is. So the answer is we can reduce nuclear weapons, but we have to do it in concert with what's going on in Russia and what's going on in China. So we need to work together. And I've said a number of times that if you look at all these dangers, particularly catastrophic terrorism and cyber and so forth, the world is in a race between cooperation and catastrophe. And right now, cooperation is not running very fast.
One of the things that I was reading about was the nuclear weapons, the low-yield nuclear weapons. And that, do we need those? Doesn't that start sort of an arms race of other nations wanting the low-yield nuclear weapons?
Well, you don't want to make nuclear weapons usable. The head of our Strategic Air Command, I call it Strategic Air Command, that's old school, is Strike Command now. General Hayden said within the last year testimony that all nuclear weapons are strategic. There's no such thing as a tactical nuclear weapon. If someone uses a nuclear weapon, the world has changed and the response will probably be strategic. So I subscribe to that theory. And I think a lot of conversation about usability of nuclear weapons, whether it comes from the Russian side, where they have a sort of a loose vocabulary of escalate to de-escalate. I don't think there's any such thing as escalating with nuclear weapons to de-escalate. General Hayden made it clear that he doesn't think that either. So this is something that ought to really be debated. We've always had lower yield weapons, but the terminology in this nuclear posture review seems to indicate that the United States believe to counter Russia's escalate to de-escalate, we need to have more usable nuclear weapons and new nuclear weapons. So I think that raises serious questions, and I think the burden is on those who think we need new weapons for that purpose. And particularly the concern I have is the reference to having a small nuclear weapon on a missile on a submarine. These submarines are our most survivable part of the triad. If we shoot a small nuclear weapon off the submarine, how in the world is Russia or any other country going to know that it's not the real biggest nuclear weapon we have? And what would we do if everybody goes to that concept and we start having small weapons being shot off submarines or with that capacity? So I think this is a really dangerous move, and I think there are serious questions that have to be raised on it. Now, on the other hand, there's also discussion of a cruise missile, sea-launched cruise missile, to counter the Russian violation of INF, which is of grave concern. And I think that one has room for real discussion. But to take one of our, we call them boomers, Trident submarines, and put a small warhead on it and act like the other countries would know it's a small warhead when it's being fired, to me raises serious questions. The other factor here would be, do we reveal the location of the submarine?
Well, when we shoot one off, don't they know where the location is?
The trajectory would show where it is
at that point.
And I would be shocked if they didn't lay down as many nuclear warheads as they could in that region, even though the sub would move out because they would fire under the sea. But I think this raises some very big stability concerns, and I'm hoping Congress will ask these hard questions because this is serious stuff.
The way, as a non-sophisticated person in nuclear technology, the way I see these low-yield nuclear weapons is sort of mini nukes, and I don't quite understand why we need mini nukes. I mean, I guess it's because if the Russians lobby a mini nuke or a low yield someplace, we want to respond likewise and not use one of the big nukes and take out as something catastrophic. On the other hand, it creates a whole new arms race, maybe, to me, because other countries will want them as well. Secondly, why don't conventional weapons, why wouldn't they serve the purpose? Can conventional weapons answer a low yield?
Yes, I think all of those are relevant questions and good questions. We also already have low yield. We've had low yield for a long time. We even had weapon you could carry this big, that we had ADMs that you put in holes in the ground and to fill the gap. So we've had them a long time. The real danger is the psychology, and when we start advertising as the United States, as a country that's the strongest military in the world, that we need a whole new weapon system and that we are thinking about having a weapon that is more usable. Now, those who are for it would argue, well, they don't believe you'll use a big one. Well, I don't know whether that's accurate or not, but in my view, U.S. and Russia, if we both start talking about usability and then you project that on the other 7 nuclear powers in the world or nuclear weapon states, I think the world becomes very, very dangerous.
What's the situation between the United States and Russia? How much notice do we have of each other using these weapons? Because I know that you've been outspoken about that.
Well, the United States and Russia have never had much decision time for leaders. If there was some kind of warning, the President of the United States and the President of Russia don't have much time. You can debate whether it's 2 minutes or 5 minutes or 7 minutes, but the point is we should both be working to increase decision time.
And especially in light of the fact there have been mistakes.
Absolutely. False warnings, and as I mentioned, cyber attacks where someone simulates an attack, you have a false warning or they interfere with cyber. Even non-nation states might interfere with cyber command and control. And so I think the lack of decision time is fundamental. And it would be my view that the world would be a lot safer if the United States president and the Russian president and hopefully eventually the other nuclear weapon states would say to their military commanders, go off and get in a room with each other and come back and give us more decision time. If we have 5 minutes now, give us 10 minutes before we have to either use them or lose them. And when we get to 10 minutes, let's go to 20, and then 20 to an hour, and an hour to a day, and then a week. And then nuclear weapons become less relevant. And guess what? If they become less relevant, then we can begin decreasing the numbers of nuclear weapons. But if we make nuclear weapons more and more relevant, and that's the big question in this posture review, are we making them more relevant? Are we increasing? For instance, there's at least an implication in the nuclear posture review that's just come out that we might respond to a non-nuclear attack with nuclear weapons if it's a cyber attack, a major cyber attack. Well, this raises questions about attribution. Do we really know where it came from? And then we have to ask the question, if the other 8 countries do the same thing, and now we've got nuclear weapons around the world responding to a major cyber attack, how do we know it's not third parties? How do we know who it is? So we don't want to go down that route unless we ask some very, very serious questions, and in my view have discussions with the other nuclear weapon states. Communication in this era is enormously important because all nuclear weapon states have grave dangers facing them, and if we don't have some rules of the road in the cyber world, if we don't have rules of the road on decision time, then I really fear for the future of our children and grandchildren.
I'm joined here in the studio by a panel of nuclear experts. Hans Christensen is director of the Nuclear Information Project at the Federation of American Scientists. Peter Hussey is director for Strategic Deterrence Studies at the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies at the U.S. Air Force Association. And Matthew Koenig is an associate professor at Georgetown University and author of a new book coming out tomorrow, The Logic of American Nuclear Strategy. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me. I would sort of go down the row and start first to you, Hans. Are we moving in a safer direction or more dangerous direction with nuclear weapons and our strategy?
We're moving in a more dangerous direction, I think, because it's one that's beginning to embrace more than we have done so in the recent past. So more in direct confrontation with new nuclear weapons capabilities. We're beginning to buy in my view, to the type of philosophy that the Russians have been demonstrated, that there is a usability for nuclear weapons with low yield, etc.
Matthew.
Well, I disagree. I think the Russians and the North Koreans and others have made the world more dangerous over the past several years. And so what this U.S. nuclear strategy does is make the world safer by responding to that, by having an effective deterrent to convince Putin, convince Kim Jong-un that they can't get away with nuclear attack, that the U.S. arsenal will continue to deter attacks on us and our allies in Europe and in Asia.
Peter.
I would agree with Senator Nunn and disagree with him. The TLAM, or the cruise missile, is what we had before 2010. And the Japanese and our East Asian Pacific allies said it was wonderful. And when we took it down, they were very worried our deterrent was being withdrawn. Also, a submarine-launched cruise missile in Europe doesn't have to worry about where it's based. And Senator Nunn said it needs to be survivable. A plane on an airfield in Europe that's dropping gravity bombs that takes a long time to get to target, the cruise missile gets there quicker, and it's survivable, so that it actually what Senator Nunn said is right. It actually increases stability.
But do we need the low-yield nuclear weapons? Why don't the conventional weapons we have already address that?
Okay, let's say you're in Europe and you have Russia going into Latvia, Estonia, and one of the Baltics, and they threaten, as they have, their doctrine was calling it escalate to de-escalate. They're going to threaten to use nuclear weapons unless we stand down and basically don't come to the defense of our allies. And the only thing we have are CONUS-based, American-based or submarine-based on the ocean, weapons that are 400 to 600 kilotons. which would take out most of the countries we're trying to save. Good deal of them, okay? Plus, you may not want to go there. The leverage you have of deterrence is that you have options, and you're not just stuck in one route. And since we've had low-yield weapons throughout the deterrent age, in fact, I was reading an Arms Control Association briefing just a couple days ago saying they said, we already have a robust, flexible deterrent that includes low-yield options. The cruise missile in Europe is survivable and much quicker to target. It doesn't take hours, it takes minutes. That is a big deterrent. With respect to the Trident, Senator Nunn's point, the Russians don't know what's coming out of the water anyway. I mean, they don't know whether the yield's 400 kilotons or 300 or 500. Really doesn't matter, because in a situation where you're having crisis and a conflict, is the United States going to launch a D5 out of the ocean that has 5 warheads on it? Okay? Probably not. But Europe, Great Britain, reduced the yield on their Vanguard class weapons, which are strategic, and did so years ago, in which no one said anything against it, because they said we want a sub-strategic capability. Now, I actually agree with General Hyten, who I know pretty well. Using a nuclear weapon is using a nuclear weapon, and that's what we want to avoid, and that's what we're trying to do.
Hans, we have conversations with Russia about nuclear weapons, not so much with North Korea. And in fact, I don't think we have any with North Korea, but then there's always the concern, at least I have a question, what about terrorists? Do they have access to any of these? I mean, do we have to worry about them? I suppose we have to worry about cyber terrorism, and that they could send a warning that's false. They could do that, but could they get like a low yield?
Well, that's been a concern for a long time. Of course, the terrorists could get their hands on something. Terrorist organizations don't have the capacity to produce nuclear weapons, and so I think they would have to get it from somewhere.
But couldn't they get it from AQ Khan in Pakistan? Certainly was happy to be like the Walmart of nuclear weapons. I mean,
potentially.
But is it that the know-how's out? There's know-how out there, and there's material at least in 40 nations. So is it that hard to get?
It is hard to get. Apparently, it's harder to get than we thought. Certainly harder to make it into a weapon. But I think I want to warn a little against this notion here that we somehow have a choice between low yield or no low yield, or modernization or no modernization. I think the United States has a very flexible military posture that includes the full range of options, going from very low. General Hyten from Stratcom just explained that in Congress last year, from very low all the way to the top, that can present the president with any option he needs. So this notion that we somehow have a gap and that has an influence on what the Russians are doing, I think is flawed.
Matthew, what about North Korea? You brought up North Korea. I mean, the conversations with, I worry less about Russia because we're talking to them, but we're not talking to North Korea. Yeah. And they've had ICBM and they've had these tests.
North Korea is a real threat, only the third U.S. adversary with the ability to possibly threaten nuclear war against the U.S. homeland. So we need to have a serious deterrence strategy there. I think that there's no question that we have clear superiority over North Korea. If they used a nuclear weapon, that would mean the end of the regime.
But that's second. I mean, that's after they've done their damage. That's the problem. I mean, we do, according to the NPR, is that we're going to do it defensively, although there's some sort of hint that, I mean, there's a little leeway in there, I suppose.
We have missile defense.
Yeah. Why do we have missile defense? But do you trust the missile defense? Anyway,
yes.
so.
Well, we're going to make it better.
It's very hard for me to imagine the United States attacking North Korea first. But if North Korea used a nuclear weapon or two, we'd want to make sure that they couldn't use a third or a fourth. So that requires the ability to identify and destroy North Korea's nuclear capability.
But do we have the ability to protect ourselves from number one and number two, protect Japan, to protect South Korea?
Well, that's what the missile defenses are for. They work? If you look at the testing data, the theater range systems are about 75%. So that's much better than 0%. And, if you're Kim Jong-un, that raises the bar. I did want to comment on two of the other things quickly, on why conventional. It doesn't matter what we think. We might think our conventional weapons are impressive. It matters what Putin thinks. And I think there's a lot of evidence right now that Putin's not deterred by our current posture. He thinks he can get away with one of these limited nuclear strikes. And so that's one of the reasons we have to do something different.
Yeah, Greta, let me, if I just intervene a little bit on missile defense. 4 of the last 5 missile tests of our national system that used the upgraded kill vehicle worked. That's number one. Number two, Senator Inhofe has sent a letter to Senator Cochran for $100 million for a boost phase defense over Korea, which would be out in the field 12 to 18 months. This is, even critics of missile defense have talked about using unarmed vehicles and drones to carry a missile that would hit. Now, it's not easy to do, But when you can get a missile just after it's fired, within 3 to 5 minutes, that's a big difference.
Let me ask Hans, in terms of false alarms, we've had false alarms. Serious ones, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they happen in different areas. And the problem with false alarms is always that you never know how they happen. You're always surprised. So you can take whatever step you need to take to try to prevent it.
How much time do you have on a false alarm, though?
Well, it takes about 30 minutes from an ICBM to fly from Russia to here, and one of ours to go there. If you have a submarine off a coast, you can get much closer, and you can get a warhead on target within about 12, 13 minutes.
And then, Matthew, on the NPR, is there anything besides, it says that we'll use them only in extreme circumstances. That's not defined, though.
Yes. Well, that's always been U.S. nuclear policy, to use nuclear weapons to deter strategic attack on us and our allies, not just nuclear attack. So during the Cold War, the primary purpose was to deter a Russian conventional invasion of Western Europe. Yes. After the end of the Cold War, bipartisan consensus that we use nuclear weapons to deter biological, chemical weapons attack. So this has always been U.S. policy that we use nuclear weapons to deter things other than nuclear attack. The technology changes, and so that doctrine needs to adapt with new technology.
And the goal is never to use them at all, never to have to use them at all anyway.
Exactly.
Thank you, gentlemen, very much. That's all the time we have for today. I'd like to thank my guest. Hans Christensen is Director of the Nuclear Information Project at the Federation of American Scientists. Peter Hussey is Director for Strategic Deterrence Studies at the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies at the U.S. Air Force Association. And Matthew Koenig is an Associate Professor at Georgetown University and the author of a new book out tomorrow, The Logic of American Nuclear Strategy. Thank you all for joining me.
Thank you.
And before we go, today is a very sad day for so many of us all around the world. Reverend Billy Graham has died. He was 99 years old. Now, I have my personal story. I've spent time with him. I did Reverend Graham's last interview, emceed his 95th birthday, and my husband and I have traveled the world with his son, Reverend Franklin Graham, who has carried on his father's mission to help the less fortunate and to minister to others. But today is about Reverend Billy Graham, as we all feel a loss. We also celebrate his goodness. He saw it in everyone. He had a deep and lifelong commitment to God that he shared with presidents, to Queen Elizabeth, even to Muhammad Ali, and to the less fortunate. He wanted everyone to know about God. He also did the courageous. He dared to go behind the Iron Curtain to talk about God. Reverend Billy Graham never wavered in his deep commitment to God, and today he's left us, but through his work, he has left us better. If Billy Graham had an impact on your life, please leave a comment on my Facebook page at facebook.com/Greta. That's all the time we have for today. Stay plugged in by liking us on Facebook at Voice of America. You can also like my Facebook page at facebook.com/Greta, and you can follow me at Twitter at Greta. Thank you for being plugged in. We'll see you next week.